This is Gen AI for Health and Life Sciences. That's the title. We're going to keep this interactive, so we're going to have short introductions and opening statements from people. Ask lots of questions. I have about 3 or 4 slides, which is absolutely wonderful that Hoifung spoke before me, because basically that's going to repeat what
I'm going to hand you this microphone.
Gen AI is going to change this world. I'll just stand here. Yeah. So it really has a profoundly important role, and our experts will all speak to that role. I'll give you some examples, and these will look very familiar because you probably saw things like these just now in Hoifung's talk. So I just picked out some slides from my own papers the past 4 or 5 months. So that's something called annotate any cell, and I think Hoifung set this up beautifully. Pathologist's job is to look at that little slide and try to figure out which one of those cells is actually cancerous and make some more judgments on it. That's, of course, a miserably hard job, and in fact, as Hoifung said, you turn that thing sideways, you see different things in that picture. So this tool basically lets you annotate pathology images like this. It's a beautifully simple semi-supervised tool where it segments every cell, moves it to a latent space, and then as you sparsely annotate cells, it recomputes that latent space in such a way that cells separate themselves, and once you're satisfied, you can say commit, and the moment you commit, the entire slide lights up with every cell and says these are the different kinds of cells. So it's a beautiful little tool. It's actually not published, but it's being used in a lot of hospitals right now. So at some point, I have to get my act together and get the students to write this paper. But it works. Hoifung, by the way, why aren't you here? You are on the panel. I apologize. I should have seen this. Here's another example. I think Hoifung mentioned this as well. This is multimodal as well. So this is how do you take transcriptomes and generate images out of them. So this is really cool. Data prep is a lot harder here. And the beautiful thing is you can actually do this. So we have pathologists on our team where we take transcriptomes and we generate the image. And the first time we did it, we didn't actually, so our pathologist, his name is Mario Sola. We didn't tell Mario that this was actually synthetically generated. He looked at it, he goes, oh, melanoma. I'm going like, no, that's synthetic. And indeed, yes, the transcript had markers for melanoma, which is why the image looks like it has melanoma. So we can do these beautiful things where we can generate images out of transcriptomes. And the reason you might want to do this is because if you simply give 20,000 transcripts to a pathologist, he would not know what to do with it, but you give him an image, he will immediately look at this and say, that's a melanoma. So we can do this beautifully and very simply. We can do more. So that's an example of where you take a single cell from a tumor sample, and I can tell you for each, remember, a single cell means you get the transcripts from each cell. I can look at each cell and tell you, okay, that is a tumor cell, that is likely to be non-metastatic or locally metastatic or distant metastatic, and I can, with very high likelihood, predict where the distant site is going to be. Pretty cool that we can do these things with great accuracy now. This is even more fun. So once you've done all of these things, you can predict drug response. So now you can feed these models either the transcripts or the images themselves and say, I'm going to expose this cell to these drugs. What's going to happen to it? And I can generate the entire trajectory of what's going to happen to that cell. So I don't want to talk for too long. Just some examples of stuff, and that's just from our group, and I imagine there's like hundreds of groups like ours doing very similar work. So really, really powerful technologies that you can pull out at this point, and a lot of, Hoifung just set this up beautifully. These are all multimodal models which basically operate in some latent space where you can move across all of these modalities and make very powerful predictions. All right, I'm going to stop at this point because you've heard enough of me. We have a wonderfully distinguished panel. Professor Jagadish from Michigan, Professor Ghosh from Texas, Professor Takmov from Minnesota, of course, Professor Fu from Minnesota, Professor Bayat from Minnesota as well, and of course, Dr. Poon, you've just heard from Microsoft. If it's okay, we'll just start in that order. We'll have some opening statements. We have a bunch of questions. We'll start with the questions, but I will just open it out anyway. We'll take every question, we'll have an answer, and then please feel free to ask questions, and we'll make it wonderfully. It's late in the afternoon. People are starting to get sleepy. Let's keep the energy up. Maybe that'll be a good thing. Please, Jag. I'm sorry.
So
I am from the University of Michigan. I'm a computer scientist, and I direct the Michigan Institute for Data and AI in Society. We work with people across the university in many different disciplines. And when I was thinking about this panel and what I would say, I think the most relevant current work that I'm doing is with colleagues who are actually clinical care providers at the University of Michigan Hospital. And I think my summary statement there is because of the way laws are, there is a non-scientific barrier to adoption of new technologies, and there is a great deal of thought about how one should do this and how one can go about doing this in terms of existing workflows. And I don't know, I'm just going on, right? Okay. So I want to tell you about a couple of different things. So in terms of Gen AI, one place which is basically a no-brainer is providing after-visit summaries. It's easy to record a conversation, easy to transcribe it. We've got any number of commercial products, including from Microsoft, that do a very good job of summarizing meetings. This is not the same thing as summarizing a meeting. If you've looked at your after-visit summary, there are usually some specific action items, et cetera, et cetera. But even in this sort of scenario, and then this actually legally turns out to be a very straightforward thing, because irrespective of how the thing is generated, there is officially a provider review and sign-off. And so it's simply reducing effort, and the care provider is still taking responsibility. But even in this really easy case, it turns out that there are gotchas. Gotchas include things like patients who will talk off topic with their care provider. And some of the stuff is just merely irrelevant. There's other stuff that's potentially embarrassing or sexual in nature, or, not between doctor-patient, they're talking about their behavior. Things like this, which have nothing to do with the specific medical complaint or issue being that was part of the record. And so there is a need to actually sanitize things. And these are the sorts of customizations that one has to come up with. Not rocket science, but you need to understand the application and tune the product if you're going to do this right. So that's one easy case, right? The same thing becomes a very hard case where you look at responding to patient requests on a patient portal. Because that's a place where a chatbot should be able to do stuff, and nobody is going to risk having a chatbot doing that. And that is, I think, in terms of current technology, I don't know how we get around that. Right? There are a whole bunch of very smart people looking at how to do better, but how to do better is not it requires a certain big step function. So there isn't a gradual path there, right? We've all been talking these 2 days, and I guess for years now, about hallucinations and the issues they cause. I'm going to end with one more vignette. This is, again, this is just a different modality. So when there's this whole field of reconstructing models of 3D things from a bunch of 2D images, right? And your MRIs and CAT scans and all of this stuff, right? So there's a lot of good signal processing and math that is used for this primarily, and the goal always is you want to take as few of the two-dimensional images as possible, subject the patient to as little radiation as possible, have your machine occupied for as little time as possible, right? And still get a reconstructed image that is high quality. It turns out that generative AI, specifically diffusion models, are a good way to do significantly better than the traditional signal processing techniques. And so there's a bunch of stuff that some of my colleagues are doing that really has legs. The big technical challenge here is that you're often looking for small artifacts that occur rarely. And so if you're using a generative model, you want to make sure that your generative model isn't going to miss those small artifacts and generate the artifact-free image, because that's the more common thing to expect. I'm going to stop here, and I'll say more in reaction.
We're just going by the order of the screen now.
Okay, I'm good. I'm not seeing it. So, well, I think I'll start with Amara's law, since you brought it up. And the other reason I want to start with that is because I can set the clock back, because that gives me an excuse to talk a little bit about history. So in 2013, which is 12 years back, Vinod Khosla, the famous venture capitalist and technologist and so on, he wrote an 80-page article saying 20% doctors included. And basically what he was trying to argue is that 80% of the work, this is 2013, remember, so before Gen AI and really before deep learning. Deep learning just got started. 80% of what physicians do and their staff do can be done better and cheaper and more reliably by data science and software. In fact, he made a huge statement saying, in 10 years, software and data science, there was no Gen AI there, so will do more than entire field of medicine and biological science, which are two huge fields, right? But he was not, well, of course, these are VC people, they always think much faster ahead, right? And he was also putting a lot of money into a whole bunch of healthcare startups. So turned out Amara's law applied, and the initial development wasn't as fast as expected, but now it's really started ramping up. So you're trying to get lunches, which I'm not sure if they're free, but they're pretty cheap, okay? So let me try to, the reason I brought this up is because some of the precursors of what is happening now were actually being set at that time, and we need to understand that both from the technological viewpoint and also from the the processes that the medical, that you just alluded to, the medical industry operates on. So there are some fundamental shifts. One is to try to move from pay per visit to value-based healthcare, where the better predicting outcomes will lead to faster and cheaper treatments, because you're being paid for the not for procedure, but for the patient as a person, a fixed amount per patient. The second major trend was digitization of health and healthcare, and the associated movements like quantified self and the activist health consumer. You want to go to a WebMD and then say, hey, but WebMD told me this is what's wrong with me, and then the doctor says, okay, smart Alec, shut down and open your mouth. Okay, so all those things, and I think they've all led to this. And initially, I think one of the reasons the adoption wasn't so, the usual data issues and so on, but also, this is a very this is a very mature industry. They're very careful about everything they do. They're very strict processes and so on. So it's not that unless you rigorously prove something, it's not going to be adopted. Okay, so I think there are many reasons I think why it didn't escalate so rapidly. And IBM found that at a great loss of treasure and time that IBM Watson Health could not be adopted as fast as they would think, just purely based on the technical merits of the product, because there were so many other factors at play. But I think with Gen AI, several things have happened. There's, of course, the remarkable improvements in image understanding, which I'm sure you'll cover, so I'll shut up on that. But the other thing is, there's this whole problem of data, but suddenly you have a technique where you can understand and digest huge amounts of text, right? If you think about a patient's clinical review, actually the patient's clinical review chart is the starting point for care. And the review chart may go over many years and across different modalities and have great amount of information, right? And the problem is, you can't even, just to extract that reliably and get it into a table is highly problematic. It's not even clear what the table should be. And in fact, many variables in the table may not be useful, may only apply at certain parts. So for example, the fact that you are susceptible to falling may not be relevant while you're being treated, but may be relevant when you're discharged. And how will you go home? So suddenly that variable becomes, so suddenly, this technology can now reliably extract lots of deep, rich information in a cleaner way from medical charts. Okay? The other thing to realize is that, again, it's all tied to text, and that's why I really liked your positioning that pathology, whatever, they're always notes. But the other thing about things being tied to text is that in this technology, you embed text into a semantic space, right? Where similar texts and hence similar patients, hence similar trials, hence similar treatments, et cetera, can all be mapped to one or a set of latent spaces, right? And then you can try to make connections between these latent spaces. And I think conceptually that's a very profound tool. Why? Because you might be a very rare patient, but still you have a very long medical history. There are many other aspects of you for which there'll be somebody who's similar. But the similar is in a soft sense, of course. You're in a latent space. The same with drugs. I'm on the machine. I actually forgot to introduce myself. So I'm from the University of Texas, Austin. I'm in the EC department, but I do machine learning for healthcare. And so I have courtesy appointment, for example, with Dell Medical School in the Department of Population Health, which is ironic because I normally am not interested in population health. I'm interested in personalized health because we want to predict at the individual level, right? But anyway, that's the department they put me. I did not quibble about it. So anyway, that's my history. So what was I talking about? Yeah. So in machine learning, if you have a drug, you say, okay, this is drug A, you give a class label, or outcome B that has a class label, and then you try to predict the label, right? But if you think about it, the drug actually has a lot of description. It's a whole chemical description, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of, it's just not a label. There's a lot of very rich information. And now, why is that more useful to think about that in terms of that rather than the label? Because now I'm hypothesizing creating a new drug. Okay, I have not done clinical trials on it yet, but I have a description of the new drug. So now I can map it into the same semantic space and try to see from the known interaction of patients with the previous drug and the other drug, I can try to guess which patients may be recruited for a trial for this new drug, and even whether the new drug may be useful or not, and try to guess its outcome without running any clinical trial. So this is actually a zero-shot clinical trial prediction, right? But these things are actually possible. We've actually done some experiments. I won't go into the technical things, but this was the key idea. And even without hypothetical drug, you have some information about it, and you can make a pretty good guess, even without running it. So I think these are some aspects where suddenly I think this promise, which was made 12 years back, has really become turbocharged. I think the lunch is not free yet, but it's getting cheaper. Okay? So I can elaborate many more on this. And then the other aspect is, of course, the various processes, explanation of benefits, interfacing the customer, the insurance part and customers. I've worked with several companies on these. All these various medical processes have also become much better and much cheaper. Even the synthetic human voice, which is now much more realistic, has a huge role in making medicine much more affordable and accessible. Even explaining what's happening. So maybe I'll give a last anecdote. So 5 or 6 years back, I went to my physician for the annual, and he has a scribe, right? This is a guy who makes notes when he's talking. And I was seeing what this guy does, and I said, sir, I think AI wasn't popular then, so algorithm can actually do this transcription very easily and reliably, and you eventually will not need this type of a human scribe, right? And he basically gave that look, smart aleck, shut up and open your mouth type of a thing. And that was the end of it. And then last year when I visited him again, I saw that he had a little earpiece and a little mic here, and there was no scribe. Okay? Also, there's much better connection with the medical terms, so things can be auto-corrected and so on. And so clearly it is happening. So, sometimes the technology was there 5 years, 6 years, 8 years back, but it's happening for multiple reasons. One is there's much more pressure on the healthcare industry to reduce costs. And there's also much more, because of the hype of AI, it's lifted all boats. So there are many more people who are willing to try it out than there were a few years back. Okay, so with the example, I'll pass this on. Thank you.
Jasmine.
Oh. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so for introduction, my name is Jasmine Fu. I am a faculty member in the math department here at the University of Minnesota. I am also the co-director of the Therapy Modeling and Design Center, which we started last year. Maybe I'll talk more about that in a minute, but just to give you a little bit of my trajectory, my background is in math, applied math. I started out in uncertainty quantification and stochastic finite elements, stochastic spectral methods. But then sort of quickly or early on in my career moved into mathematical biology and medicine, and got interested in developing stochastic models for understanding cancer progression and evolution. Did some postdocs at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Memorial Sloan Kettering, and have been working basically in quantitative biology since then. So my research group, one big mainstay of our research program is to develop models of treatment optimization and drug resistance. And this sort of speaks a lot to the themes we've heard a lot about precision health and medicine, precision treatment. And in recent years, we've also gotten really interested in developing models for interpreting and pulling out deeper insights from experimental data that's being generated in novel experimental platforms. So you may have heard about things like organoids, organ on chip, spheroids, microtissues, these sorts of really cool devices. They're all model systems. So we want to take what's happening in those platforms and translate them into actionable clinical information. We need to understand how to interpret data from organ on chip, right? So we've been really interested in applying mechanistic models to understanding when something happens in an organ on chip, what does that mean? What does that mean will happen in a patient? And I think that's a really hard question that speaks a little bit to why I'm here, why I'm interested in in this topic. So I think all this is to say, I think in this room, I would be considered a domain scientist. I'm not really an expert in AI/ML, but let's see. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing at the Therapy Modeling and Design Center, where I think there's a lot of potential for connection with Gen AI. So we are, basically our vision is to apply mathematical and computational modeling to help aid in the therapy development process. And so there's many points along a drug development pipeline in which I think quantitative approaches can help, from the target finding, which is a common topic in probably in this room, all the way to optimizing the design of particular nanotherapies, identifying which patients are going to benefit the most, which patients aren't going to benefit from particular therapy, understanding toxicity constraints, figuring out how to best deliver the therapy. So what's the dosing regimen? What should you combine it with? So all along this pipeline, there are so many opportunities to apply quantitative modeling. And maybe we'll just mention that there's been, sort of policy shifts like quite recently from FDA and other governmental agencies signaling kind of a shift away from wanting to do as much animal testing for toxicity in drug development. And they're really sort of wanting to bolster things like computational modeling and ex vivo experimental platforms, so these organoids and organ on chip and things like that. So coming back to the connection to Gen AI, a lot of the problems that we see in the center have the kind of characteristic that, we've got many different types of data. Maybe we have 2 or 3 different types of in vitro data, so 2D cell culture, organ on chip, organoid. Then we've got multiple model systems, so not human, but we've got mouse data, non-human primate, things like that. And then maybe we've got a small smattering of clinical human data if we're lucky. So huge discrepancies in model systems. Huge discrepancies in the amount of data available in each of these model systems. Basically, the closer you get to human, the less data you're going to get. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is trying to understand what are the commonalities that we can pull out. What are the lessons we can pull out from one model system that we know are going to apply in another model system? And how can we translate this ultimately to the clinic? So, a lot of our expertise in the center has to do with really interfacing closely with the biologists, with the clinicians, with these people who are creating these amazing new drugs, therapies, biologics, things like that, and really understanding, what's at the forefront of the mechanistic knowledge of how these things work, and really understanding from them, what are the design levers? If I'm making a nano ring medicine, what are the things that you can change about it that we might be able to optimize? We want to be able to use these kinds of knowledge to build models that we can then take to optimization and say, okay, well, here's going to be the profile of your optimal design. This is what we think you should try next. But of course, we don't know everything about the mechanisms. And so is there a way to leverage this very, very imperfect data along with these partial and imperfect mechanistic models to put things together and develop principled approaches to figuring out how to best support this therapy development pipeline. So I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jasmine. Mahdi, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mahdi Bayat. I'm a faculty member in the Institute for Health Informatics and Medical School here at the U. My background is electrical engineering. My journey in healthcare started with working on non-invasive, basically imaging techniques for non-invasive surgery. And I did a postdoc at Mayo Clinic afterwards, which I went through that Grama's law in a way, and starting with highly enthusiastic, basically from that engineering and scientist mindset, going into witnessing how the actual practice of medicine is performed and how the knowledge and the research basically gradually being translated into the practice from that small angle that I had and the opportunity that I had. Basically trying to understand what is that we can do as engineers, as tool developers, and in future or in career development as scientists, as contributor basically to knowledge development in biomedical science and medicine that can actually help patient care. And after that, I had an opportunity to join Case Western Reserve University, and I worked on. I was very fortunate to collaborate with physician, clinician, scientists at Cleveland Clinic and also University Hospital, which is affiliated with Case Western Reserve University. Like I said, my entry into the healthcare has been through the window, basically medical imaging, starting off with creating reconstruction techniques for novel imaging methods, and then gradually entering into the domain of image analysis and most recently deep learning, and basically at the scale. We created these narrow, basically supervised model for specific applications. A lot of physicians created these problems that we have this imaging techniques that create this high yield imaging, but we have no idea how to analyze them and make sense of them because it's really very difficult, and the data is prohibitively large for any analysis to be done. I think that was a very good entry point into utilizing these data-driven models into the field. And I really enjoyed the supervision that I received from the clinicians that basically is the problem is articulated, is dictated by the physician. It's one of those rare situations that we as basically as scientists and researchers, we find that we grab the opportunity that sure, let's see what we can do. And that was a particular project on imaging of the eye, revealing some of the structures which are very basically crucial for the development of glaucoma and congenital glaucoma in general, in particular. So along the way, you come across a lot of problems that you face. So a lot of the assumptions that we make about the image acquisition, heterogeneity basically, or harmonization of the images, they fail very quickly. Patient motions, a lot of different things can swing basically the data and skew the data in different ways. And that sort of basically helped me to understand what's the domain basically knowledge has to do and has to say in the practice of medicine in general. In going through the full cycle of the Amara's law, basically, I recovered from that. And now I'm a faculty member in Institute for Health Informatics. We have data, we have hypotheses, we have a lot of ideas that I hope that we can find that sweet spot, the balance basically, where we can make a fair and good assumption about the type of problem that we can tackle and address with the type of tools that we have and the type of data that we have access to gradually basically push this front forward. And I'm highly encouraged to basically the pioneering work by Dr. Poon today and so many other leaders in the field, which I look up to these works, and we would like to build on those. But also at the same time, I would like to bring that critical view that I went through basically and learned going through these major healthcare providers and see how we can basically close the loop and bridge the gaps basically to make them more translational and useful for patient care.
Thank you very much. Hoifung, would you like some more minutes or should we? All right, excellent. The energy in the room is low, so let me start with a couple of jokes. And I was trying to find this meme, and I couldn't find that meme. so there was a meme that a few months back, or maybe a year back, somebody sent me. It said, in 2015, Bill Gates said, in 10 years we won't need radiologists anymore. Computers will basically make the job of radiology automated. And then also in 2015, there was a quote which said, this is Elon Musk saying in 10 years we will have self-driving cars, blah, blah, blah. And the picture was somebody driving in Atlanta somewhere in a 1990 Honda Accord, and it said, and here's a radiologist driving a 1990 Honda Accord in 2025. I thought that was funny. I think the other joke was, as we were talking about this came to my mind. I don't know if you've been following, there was a controversy of one of these Gen AI companies, which it turned out had a whole slew of Indians sitting on the other side of their Gen AI, and you type something in, and a gentleman in India would respond to your prompt. This is real. This is not a joke.
Yeah.
This is the modern day Mechanical Turk, but the joke part of it, as it came to me, was we were talking about automated radiology and things like that. Well, that's not really different from what happens right now. I mean, we have a radiograph. It goes off to India or some other country, and that's at night. That's day there, and a whole bunch of doctors sit and write a report, and the report shows up here. Now, that is a Gen AI model for all we care, but it is intelligence. But nevertheless, two jokes. So let's start with the question. So the first question is, how can Gen AI be used to generate new scientific hypotheses in biology, validate candidates? But I think the essence of this question is that disease by its very nature is rare. Individuals are all different. We are not all the same. If we were all the same and diseases were all generic, this would not be a major challenge. So the key challenge, in my opinion, in biology is how do we model pathology that is not the norm? By definition, it's a pathology. And then how do we do it in a way that's patient-specific, which means that it is not the norm. We are all unique. So the question, there's a zero authority challenge. Yes, how can we characterize a nominal pathology? We can do that. How can we come up with a cure for a nominal patient? We can do that. But the crux of this question is, how do we incorporate the rare event and the unique aspects of individuals? And we can keep it short, and we can open it up to questions as well, if anybody wants to take this question.
So I think that the rare pathologies problem is not unique to medicine. I think that we've heard that same thing in multiple contexts over the past 2 days, field after field. I see people nodding, so I'm not going to say more about this. I do think that the overall population versus individual is a very important distinction, and is one that is not often enough made in the AI community. We build models and we evaluate them on an overall error metric aggregate. And what we seek to do is to be right more often than we're wrong, or to be right most of the time. And in a number of cases, patient care being one very clear case, but wherever humans are involved and there are human consequences to decisions, we care very deeply, or at least particular individuals care very deeply about exactly what happens in that one specific instance. And the error metrics that one needs to apply for models to work in these circumstances, I think we just need to think about what that is. There's all kinds of stuff that I've seen in terms of fiddling with the error functions and using the same crank in terms of designing AI models, and I don't think I think that helps, but that doesn't quite get us there.
Maybe I will add a couple points. When the Human Genome Project first concluded, right? They basically tally all the mutations, and then the result is actually somewhat disappointing, at least among a few folks, because the head torso, the head portion, right? The most frequent one are all the oncogenes or your tumor suppressor that everybody knows, right? P53, yeah, of course, right? KRAS and blah, blah, blah. But then the really frustrating part is that there is a giant fat tail of all those kind of like, variant of unknown significance. Like, what the hell do they do, right? So like, are they actually contributing to the cancer? So I think actually the underlying challenge is actually representation, right? It's like, so that's actually why in cancer, sort of like this cancer hallmark is such a powerful concept. Like basically they said, hey, maybe cancer target, I mean, there are 3 billion base pair out there, so many targets, right, that cancer can work on, but they are not like random. Right, so they are actually organized because biological processes are kind of like, there are lots of modularities and components, right? So then if you look at the cancer hallmark started with 8 and now 12 and you may add to 20, still a very small number, right? And those mutations, so this lead to also the concept about genetic pathway, genetic network, which means that cancer may be targeting, if you look at the representation and the mutation level, they may look very, very sparse, right? That you may call it's rare. But when you look at actually the representation of like module, functional module, pathway, network level, then suddenly they're not that sparse, right? So then, of course, the challenge then is that how do we do this representation learning efficiently, right? So in the old days, and obviously like back 20 years ago when I started in NLP, we joke about we're basically manual feature engineers. Then we pass on to an optimizer, right? Convex optimization ruled the world at that time, right? So, but then what I think a lot of the Gen AI, starting from deep learning, actually what they do is that when the human manual engineering start to break down, when you have giant dimension, when you have lots of missing data, when you have lots of noise and biases, then that manual kind of engineering become difficult, then that's actually when Gen AI can try to automatically start to uncover some of the connection underneath and learn a much better kind of representation, right? I always think about like Gen AI basically is doing a glorified PCA, right? So it's a nonlinear dimension reduction, but that's fundamentally what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think what I would like to add is in medicine, things are seen holistically and not individually, right? And that's one dimension. The other dimension is there's a lot of redundancy in diagnostic medicine. Like if one physician or one diagnostician basically is not sure, it passes on to another diagnostician basically, to another colleague, to someone else, get another opinion. So there's this basic notion of refinement at different stages and multiple basically, the redundancy that we see in commercial jets, for example, that you have so many backup systems that if one fails, the other one takes over, the other one takes over. And there's hierarchy of these, right? Because the task is so essential. You never ever want a commercial jet to fail, basically. And for the case of human health, it's the same way, basically. So if we want to brute force a single model with fixed parameters, basically one size fit all situation to address this and capture that rare case, it's doomed to fail. The only way to do it is to basically to forget about this assumption, to put this assumption away. Models have to become flexible. Models have to be more redundant. Models have to allow basically an opportunity to be tested from different angles, so those rare cases can kind of be eventually be sampled and eventually be seen by the model.
You should feel you have to, Joydeep. By all means, your opinion is very valued, but we do have 8 questions to go through. But please.
So I want, okay, let's see. So yeah, there's the representation, and I think if a holistic view of a patient's record, then you have more flexibility on focusing on the right representation, because something that looks very rare, is quite likely also showing up in some of the other part of the medical record. The other thing I wanted to point out is you can see something unusual. The standards by which we can mine the medical literature, which is extensive, has taken a quantum leap in the last 3-4 years. There are a couple of papers on that. Most of them involve a human in the loop, But you can do that, and you can try to search for evidence of some other patients in some place long time back who had something similar. And I think that's a great new tool that has come up as well. And finally, again, a human in the loop story I read recently from Mayo Clinic, which is nearby. So pancreatic cancer is number 10 in occurrence, but number 4 in fatality, because it's difficult to detect it early. So what they did is they found out people usually they get detected in 4th stage, which is pretty late. But they went back, and since they had lots of records of CT scans in the past, they would go back and look at CT scans 2-3 years back, which were flagged as okay, but now they know that this guy actually was detected later on. So they relabeled them, and then now the classifier can focus on these things that were missed earlier on. So there are also those aspects which are helping us capture more rare events.
Any questions from the audience before? Please, Professor Shaker.
Thanks. So one of the issues that ARPA, H, and others are bringing up in this space is distribution shift, right? Because our patient sample is a small fraction of the population. But once you build the model on that data and you're seeing new patients, you start to see slightly different distributions. And I think they wanted us to figure out, is there a way to monitor that your distribution has shifted from learning samples to what you're seeing today within the same hospital. Obviously, if you go across hospitals, there are other kinds of shifts which have been explored. So, but I just wanted to come back in the GenAI context. How do you think about these distribution shifts within the same hospital or across hospital? And how can we monitor, if our models need to be retrained or adjusted to maintain their accuracy?
I can start with my perspective, and maybe our panel can add to it. I think the problem with distribution shift is the subspace within which that shift happens. So the idea is, if you think of our representation in 1,000 dimension, most of those dimensions have a nominal shift anyway. I mean, there's enough noise in our nominals that you will see noise everywhere. But the signal in a distribution shift will happen in a subspace of dimension 7 inside of this dimension of 1024. But it's a very statistically significant distribution shift in a very small subdimension that is hidden in a very large, noisy dimension. That makes the problem particularly interesting and challenging. I'll let our panel add to that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think there is probably at least 2 kinds of shift, right? So one kind is like, as you talk about like a regional, like if you, I mean, AI is no magic, right? So if you force it too hard, it will just hallucinate, right? So if you have only see one patient, I mean, good luck with the generalizability, right? So I think and that problem is partially social challenge, right? It's like, can we figure out appropriate social construct with privacy, compliance, and insurance, and all those points that you guys have talked about to make sure that, actually using the real world data that patient actually and the voters are in, right? So then, I mean, there is no fundamental reason why there couldn't be a learning from all 8 billion peoples, right, except the social contract, right? I would say that's one challenge, which is like, did you subsample enough of the patient that actually, so that you can generalize, right? And then I think there is another, perhaps even more interesting distribution shift is over time, right? So actually I learned a bunch from hydrology about how the terrain change and all this kind of good stuff that actually changing the game, right? So I think like, for example, there is a lot of study to show, like, for example, some of the cancer happening much earlier, right, with younger people and so forth, right? That I think a lot of that would also change with a lot of for example, how do we diet, how do we exercise, and so there is also a temporal change there. And then I think another one, which is, I mentioned about the AJCC staging guideline, right? So they are, I think, up to 11th or 12th edition by now, right? So you might have staging, let's say in December 31st, this guy should be 3A, After the new year, it should be 2B, right? So there's also some of those kind of like maybe somewhat artificial kind of semantic drift. So I would say there are very different kind of the drift. The regional drift that I think you talk about, I think it's fundamentally really a sampling challenge, right? It's like if we do sensors, if we do survey, if we don't have enough sample, then of course AI doesn't have that much magic. You can do representation learning and so forth to hopefully it ignore a lot of the spurious kind of like stuff, but still there is an extent. You can extend the generalizability. I think the temporal and other things are also very interesting challenges.
Please go ahead. I do want to make sure we get through all of our questions.
Okay, so I'm just going to quickly say that I think that we actually need to modify how we think about the problem. I don't think the problem is one of distribution and distribution shift, which are aggregate measures. Even if we had samples from all 8 billion people in the world, we would worry about very small minorities who have certain genetic characteristics, for instance, that might be very different, maybe some isolated small tribe, things like this. Even if they were in our sample, it isn't clear that they would be properly represented in the model. And so we really have to think about, is there enough in the model to cover the particular new individual who shows up?
I think at the core of this is the model explainability. That has to be, in terms of healthcare, has to be encoded into the model, it has to be completely transparent, it has to be basically one of the main features up front. I'll give you an example, like if a data set is taken from X-ray in one hospital, which happens that the prevalence of certain disease is really high in that hospital. Another model is trained on an X-ray technology in different machine, and the prevalence of the disease is pretty low. If the models are swapped basically, and then one model is being, and these two technologies are slightly different in terms of noise or some other imaging contrast or features, it's very likely that the models basically just learn those more overlaying features as opposed to the clinical features that manifest the disease basically, and might collapse and fail or might basically create false results. Or in the case of COVID, for example, the model trained on pediatric lung cases versus a model which trained on adult cases. In pediatric cases, the reaction was not really as severe, and in adult cases were severe. So a model that sees a small lung would immediately says that this is not a severe case, without even basically seeing if there is any extensive reaction. So there has to be a way to explain to the end user, in this case the clinician, the physicians, that what is that the model is basing its decision or basically output on, to then create that kind of explainability and trust.
Thanks, Mahdi. And we're going to be, let me move to the next question simply because, and we'll come back, Sudarshan. We will have time for So let me quickly move to the third question, I suppose, second question, because the third question sort of touches on all of these issues as well. So let me set this third question up. And I think, as Mahdi said, there was mention of Mimic-4 at some point. Mimic-4 is primarily from East Coast hospitals. East Coast has a certain population demographic. You can build a model on Mimic-4, and you can build a model from Texas, and you'll probably get two different answers. And that question sort of hints at it. But basically what that question says is that a model that is 95% accurate on a cohort is not 95% accurate on an individual. In other words, you apply a model to a cohort, you say with 95% accuracy, I can predict that whether somebody drawn randomly from that cohort is going to have a certain disease or not. Yet if you give an individual the model an individual, the first result doesn't mean that the model is going to be 95% accurate for that individual. We can go into the depth of that question, but nevertheless, I think most of us understand what that question is. That is a big problem, and that problem gets in the middle of a lot of things. If you ask me, should I accept a model-based diagnosis? As a scientist, that would bother me. I'm an Indian. South Asians are more predisposed to things like triglycerides. If you take somebody of my height and weight and that person was Caucasian, that wouldn't even be a concern for them. So how do we make sure that whatever we're doing, which we are building population level models, have anything to do with individual level pathology or diagnosis or care? Please.
Yeah, so this is a really important question, and I actually don't think that it's specific to Gen AI. This is a question that has been, sort of plaguing the field of, how do we choose clinical trial objectives? How do we, choose treatment optimization objectives? What's best for one person is not necessarily the same as what's best for the cohort or what's best for a particularly vulnerable population. And there are even other sorts of versions of this problem. What's best in the short term is not necessarily what's best in the long term. That's something that we see a lot in cancer therapy. You don't always want to go for maximal tumor reduction right when you start therapy. You might be better off keeping this thing around for a long time because it's more likely to stay under control under certain situations. And then bringing in economic, what's best for a patient's, length of time without progressive disease is not necessarily what's best for, insurance, pharmaceutical companies, things like that. So I think a lot of these questions, have been thought about in other settings, and maybe a lot of them kind of veer a little bit into policy and economic decisions. But I think as sort of like practitioners of, people building models for individuals, for populations, for practitioners to use and think about, I guess, my personal opinion is that, it's our job to be aware of all the different possibilities for objective functions and to lay out all the options for people who are making these decisions.
Any other thoughts? Excellent.
Yeah.
Oh, please.
I want to also add on to say that important part of is to how do we represent uncertainty, right? Because everything in biology, right, is a probability game, right? So you take a drug, the molecule, how does it metastasize? How does it, whether it binds to a protein or not? That's all probability game. So I think one thing, but that's actually something that it's a little bit hard for during our evolution, right? Like it's that kind of uncertainty modeling, not necessarily. Especially for the longitudinal, long time scale, that's not what we intuitively would be doing. So I think that's probably really important when we think about, let's say, a virtual patient or something, right? No matter how accurate they are in the kind of like raw accuracy sense, there are actually still uncertainty remaining. And I tend to think about that. That's sort of like the uncertainty could vary in different patients, right? So, and for certain patients, the prediction can be very, the confidence window can be very small, but for some patients, the confidence window is very, very large. So how do we even kind of reason about those uncertainty quantifications and how do we represent them? How do we actually get the model to calibrate? Gen AI will always give you some numeric thing. Whether you can trust that to be probability, that's a completely different thing, right? So how can we calibrate that?
So I think the answer here is that introspection is a very important aspect, and maybe we should think of introspection more in models. Let me quickly come to the second question, and I think the essence of the second question is as follows. So if you think of how we have biology is a very data-rich field. I mean, there's tremendous amounts of data, but that data is on a canonical organism. It could be on a model organism or a canonical organism. When we sequence an individual, it's an abstract human that we're sequencing. It's not my sequence. Now, there's a wealth of data that's sitting in different databases. Now, separately, there's a very sparse sampling of me as an individual. Yes, maybe I have somebody took my temperature, my blood pressure, 5 other measures, maybe my blood work. But that's an incredibly sparse sampling of me as an individual, as opposed to all of this rich data that exists as a canonical person. Now, if you want to think of what is wrong with me as an individual, how do you build a model of me as an individual from this very sparse readout that I'm getting and this very dense set of data of a canonical individual that I have on the side? So in other words, if you're building a digital twin for me, how would you go about building that? And it's perfectly okay to say, hey, this is a ridiculous question, or this is very hard, and we'd rather not talk about it and move on.
I think the goal number one should be, in order to design an end-to-end system which can address the final question of addressing basically those rare situations or the situation that we don't have enough data, we should build on the capabilities of some of these emerging models like foundation models to create soft outputs as opposed probabilities or soft outputs as opposed to the final decision basically. Because the whole change of decision making in healthcare is more complex than just the correlation that we can tease out from basically the training model that we have. It has to go to the causal sequence of reasoning basically, that what is leading to what. I think the first help or assistance or to leverage basically these models, to leave it at that soft output level, or at most create those probabilistic outputs that can basically then inform a physician to which direction basically they focus more. Is in case of multimodality, this could be an aggregation of several embeddings basically. One of them can stand out. For example, gene mutation basically has a lot to say, but the distribution is significantly different from analyzing the pathological basically slides or histology that has been observed over so many basically the slides or so many basically time samples. Yeah, I think that is one thing that I can think of immediately of.
And I think that kind of answers the last question as well, which is how do we design loss functions that are explainable in some sense? Professor Kumar.
No, I just wanted to go back to the previous question, and then you sort of said, well, does it make sense only in this context? You know, and I think what's most. Is it okay? Yeah. Is it okay? Yeah. So what I'm finding most amazing is that the question being asked in one domain actually resonate in a different domain. So as I was listening to you pose this question, I could sort of think of the presentation by Paul from yesterday. There are a whole bunch of lakes, millions of lakes. You understand the different processes, you study them in limnology over decades and decades and decades. But given a specific lake, you're trying to figure out, is there a lake hypoxia? You know, for this one, what's causing the oxygen level to go down and the life to not survive? That's the specific lake that you're interested in because that's in your backyard. And how do you bring in knowledge of all the different processes to bring to bear? And of course, here you're talking about soil processes and then the vegetation processes. Over there, you're talking about cell processes. And in some cases, you have physical knowledge, biophysical knowledge. Some cases you only have data, perhaps, right? But I think this question is perhaps a abstract question, potentially could be asked in many, many different contexts. And I think one thing that I'm hoping through this dialogue, which is very unique in the sense that either you go to Gen AI meetings where everybody is methods-oriented person showing their cool methods on specific problems as an illustration, or you're going to different communities where they're so steeped into their own discipline that that's what they study. So I think this meeting is what helping me, and I am hearing from others as well, that they're seeing these connections across different domains. And my hope is that through these connections, through these kinds of questions that are being asked, you know, on your panel and of course many others that we have seen, maybe we can abstract out some high-level questions or model problems or model formulations that could help us drive this entire field. And it reminds me of how in the 60s and 70s, when the computer science was in infancy, which was like you can write a program and it works, right? Just like Gen AI model and it works, right? Of course, what worked 60 years ago is very different than what works now. The scales have changed, but the level of lack of structure that we had in 50s and 60s dramatically started getting reduced by the 70s, when people started building up this abstractions of algorithms and data structures and problems like traveling salesman and shortest path and minimal spelling trees and sorting, and people then figured out how do you take those problems and build formulations for them. And of course, the formulations that we're going to think about today for Gen AI are going to be completely different. It's a very, very high level problem. And through some of these questions, my hope is that perhaps as a group, as collectively, as people talking to people from different disciplines, we figure out what are the abstractions that we need to pay attention to. And I see at least one abstraction in one of your bullets here. That's number 3. And I think there were other ones that came up from time to time.
I think Jack also mentioned the rare events, and I think Hoifung mentioned UQ and
Exactly. And the other dichotomy that beautifully Hoifung showed in a slide was productivity gains versus, discovery gains? I think there were creative gains. And I like that. These are not the kinds of things we were talking about 5 years ago. Today, I don't think we would come up with this kind of distinction. And today I can sort of see, I can see how somebody could become very productive using the kinds of patterns that generally exist. I don't have to worry about for the productivity gain what happens rarely. I'm focusing on things that happen very frequently, right? Now, for the creativity, whether rarity is a plus or a minus depends upon whether you love hallucination or you don't. In some cases, having hallucination is good because it makes it more creative, and maybe one of them would help you discover a problem. I saw that, I think, in the manufacturing panel. I think it was Devesh Bhatt or somebody who sort of talked about the fact, well, maybe, right now we are reactive. Something goes wrong, and then we try to go diagnose it. Well, if I had a whole bunch of isolation, it doesn't matter, 99% of them are bad, but if even 1% of them help me diagnose a problem, I'm a winner, right? As opposed to in some cases, you don't want any hallucinations because, so these are the kinds of model problems or model situations. I don't even know what the vocabulary is. I think if we can come up with, I think we could potentially advance the field beyond saying, hey, it works. Or it doesn't work, right? You yourself see things saying, this thing works and this thing doesn't work, and I think we got to go beyond that. And hopefully this workshop is helping us taking a small step toward the direction. So I like your question when you sort of said, well, maybe I should move on. No, you don't move on. When I looked at Paul and sort of say, look, this looks very, very interesting to me.
Raj, Sudarshan, the question, I'll come back to you. Please, Sudarshan.
Yeah, thank you. I think the concept of abstractions, most of the time we discussed today, I think you guys are all expert. I'm not a healthcare guy, so I may be asking something very fundamental. Cancer has been talked quite a bit, but coronary diseases like heart diseases and gastroenterology issues, and also there are something called orphan diseases, which we don't care about in this country, and also communicable diseases like malaria and other things. What do we learn? What are the canonical set of issues across all of this? I know that this itself is a difficult problem to solve in one disease. But if you're going to go disease by disease by disease, we'll be just chasing them. Is there something beyond, because we are talking about hypothesis, scientific hypothesis. What is the canonical set of issues that cuts across all these diseases, and how we can generalize these abstractions to that level? Because if you're going to spend so much of money and effort in solving cancer, and that too cancer of a particular organ, okay? But cancer can happen everywhere. And then how do I generalize it to heart disease? How do I generalize it to other issues? And especially malaria kills more people across the board. And what do we do? In fact, Microsoft has the malaria issue. In fact, my daughter worked on malaria research for her PhD. So my interest is, are we going after some point solutions for diseases or something bigger? So that's the idea.
So I'll start with my 2 cents worth, and then I'll let our panel chime in. So I'm a computer scientist, much like half the people in this room, but I dabble with NIH quite a bit. So I think broadly you can think of diseases in the form of inherited diseases. These are mostly diseases of the gene. Degenerative diseases, these are diseases of use and age. Infectious diseases, these are diseases that we catch from each other. Maybe there are a couple of other categories. And I think there are mechanisms that are common to these. So for example, infectious diseases, you almost immediately start to look at the immune system. I would almost argue cancers are in some way degenerative. You accumulate enough mutations and bad things happen. And once again, you think of how interventions, immunotherapy is probably by far the most promising approach right now, but immunotherapy's got issues as well because certain cancers don't respond to immunotherapy because the microenvironment becomes very immune hostile, so prostate cancer doesn't cure very well with immunotherapy. And then you start looking at models of how do I make the TME of a prostate more immunocompetent as opposed to immunohostile. So immune system is sort of basically probably one of the big mechanisms by which we hit a lot of these diseases, communicable diseases. Okay, I will let the panel chime in, and I'll come back and
Yeah, I really love this question, so I can't resist to take a step. So I think what you asked actually is a really all-encompassing question, right? So because when I think about it, like, it actually really touched on multiple things beyond just AI, right? Like, for example, you talk about malaria. That's actually a semi-solved problem in the sense of technology, right? But it's just like, we have to get the medicine or in general, think about all the preventable disease, right? Like, why do we have, some of the disease that are completely controlled by vaccine in the past and now suddenly, blooming up, right? Like, those are not technology problems. Those are social failure, right? So I would say there is one big part of that, right? Like, for example, in some of the, you mentioned about malaria, and obviously that's a personal passion for Bill Gates, right? So his foundation spent a lot of resources in like African, right? So I kind of dabble, sometimes chat with those folks. And oftentimes, some of the most high-order 80-20 problem is like to get them a clean toilet, right? To get them a pharmacy, right? So to get them clean water, right? And then next order of importance would be then get some preventable like vaccine or HIV prevention, those kind of good stuff, right? So that probably is one big bucket of thing. You mentioned about cardiology, right? The reason I'm sort of like, I'm afraid to touch it is because a lot of the intervention would be behavior changes, right? It's less about, obviously I can't sometimes still resist drinking Coke or sugar waters, right? So I think those are a little bit different. And when you think about cancer, actually, in the old days, cancer actually are viewed in completely compartmentalized, right? Like famously, like lung cancer doctors don't talk to blood leukemia doctors, right? And only when we start to discover the genetic foundation, then suddenly you start to have all this pan-cancer, FDA approval drugs and so forth that target mutation rather than target the organs, right? So, but I think as you mentioned earlier, there are also still like organs still dry because the microenvironment is still shaped by those organs, right? So it's kind of really fascinating multi-scale problem. I think it's like when we think about disease, it's like maybe there is a very high level that unifying a lot of the diseases like our normal functioning just get perturbed, right? But then when we start to drill down, it's sort of like almost like hierarchies, a multi-scale problem, and also the time scale is very, very different, right? And also, I think I completely agree with what you said. It's like we shouldn't just build, let's say, imagine if tomorrow we have an 8 billion patient journey, right? We shouldn't build a module like just focusing on cancer, just focusing on cardiology, just focusing on diabetes. That's kind of like often the currently, I would say venture to start slightly overgeneralize is that currently we have this mentality of a little bit like divide. That's why like a lot of the clinical trial end up having very little participant, right? But I think what potentially this kind of representation learning and Gen AI can allow us to start to go beyond those discrete, like let's say 10,000 ICD code. Let's stop thinking about just as a 10,000 separate, completely separate thing. Can we think about them as a continuum, right? In the latent space, I think many speakers talk about, right? In the latent space, they are actually a continuum. There is actually lots of connection. And then that will be, and for example, like you mentioned about cardiology, right? So cancer actually right now, a big problem is that the cancer drugs are toxic. It damages the heart, so cardiotoxicity become a problem, right? In the old days when patients only live for 6 months, you don't worry about that. But now they can live for like 10, 20 years, then that become a major issue, right? People have died of a heart attack rather than cancer. So I completely agree, like we really need to have a holistic way to model all the comorbidities and so forth.
Just if we can add, when you talk about malaria, I know it's a question of social thing, but the drug resistance malaria is one other issue, and also overuse of antibiotics. In fact, in AAAS meeting when Ram and I were there, the person presented about what the biggest problem that is going to happen in the next 5 years in the world is the antibiotic resistance drugs, and then it's going to come and hit us very hard. So anyway.
Thank you, Sudarshan. Just in the interest of covering all the issues, I'm going to merge those two questions. So both of those two top questions have to do with the role of priors and what does bias and confounding variables and uncertainty do in what is obviously very, very high dimensional data. So let's, if you might have any thoughts on how do we incorporate meaningful priors into AI models. So it's not, I mean, yes, I can build an AI model that's going to classify something and say you got a certain disease, but that doesn't make any sense because there's not a statistical significance associated with that prediction. That statistical significance comes from the prior. Caucasians don't get sickle cell disease. So just because you can predict with 95% accuracy that somebody doesn't have sickle cell disease, it may mean absolutely nothing because the occurrence of sickle cell disease among Caucasians is less than 1% anyway. So the question is, how do we make AI tools to be a lot more prior aware in some sense, quantify their own statistical significance in addition to the prediction, and perhaps be aware of bias and confounding variables and uncertainty in both the measured variables and in the outcomes.
I think when we're talking about the confounding parameters and other basically factors influencing the output or the decision of a model, we're getting into the decision support, basically part of the medicine where you have the feature space that is coming from different modalities. Now the decision has to be made. And there are so many confounding parameters, basically. Someone in basically an elderly person has lost basically bone density, has received certain therapy, which then make them more prone to fractures or bone health issues. And now there's something that's suspected, basically. Should we factor in the osteoporosis, which is happening in the background, or the certain therapy which might have accelerated certain processes? I think this is, again, lends itself in more on the decision support part of the, which is, it has to be integrated within the basically the clinical diagnosis of the disease versus the predictive power of the model. And the model should not be brute forced in all cases to incorporate all those confounding factors. My take is a model has to do what is built to do best. Incorporating those confounding factors, which are not going to be sampled enough, which is not going to be basically built into the system, is really something that might not be even feasible, at least at this stage. As opposed to that, again, creating these multimodal systems, which each of them can do their job the best way, and incorporating with other parameters, confounding factors, to then build that more robust decision support, I think is the way to go.
So Mahdi, let me be adversarial here, simply because I enjoy this. I mean, of course, I have incredible respect for what you just said, but let me play the devil's advocate here. I would say that no AI system is useful without some strong basis in the prior. No prediction makes any sense unless you tell me whether that prediction is statistically significant. And you can't make that prediction without considering both the confounders and the priors.
I don't disagree. But we're getting into the domain of basically decision making and the probabilistic modeling, incorporating the priors into the creating those probabilities. So, and I'm sure that you can, you agree with me that the correlation that we're getting doesn't mean causality, basically.
Well, that's a whole different problem. We haven't even gone
Yeah,
to causality yet. We haven't even gone to the Bayesian world yet. I'm saying,
Right.
can we at least get to the Bayesian world as opposed to the causal world?
I don't think I disagree with you on that.
Yeah.
I fully agree with you.
Okay, good. Jaydeep, please.
So apologies for changing the direction, but I just realized, talking about probabilities, that if I don't leave in 3 minutes, probability of missing my flight will shoot up. So I just wanted to quickly go back to the out of distribution question, because I think people may not realize that in healthcare there's a meta level out of distribution problem, which is very critical if you're trying to build any commercial product. And that is, if you just move to a different hospital, the schema might look a bit different. The rules for making annotations may be different. The instrumentation might be different. So nothing else has changed, but you just move to a different hospital, and suddenly, it's out of distribution in a meta way. And if you have a commercial product, you have to deal with this. Otherwise, you can't scale. Every new engagement needs a lot more time to get going. And right now, they're being able to tackle it by, A, moving everything in representation space. So even though the schema is different, you can actually now infer across multiple tables with different schemas. Even the columns don't match. You can still do it by moving in the latent space. And the second thing you do is to have some human in the loop, like nurses and so on, to occasionally. So I think those are, and I think these two methods are also relevant to tackle these.
Yeah. So let me just take the last question in the interest, and 5 seconds. What is fairness? What is a measure of fairness? And just in an analytical sense. So yes, outcome fairness is, I could argue, is not a good measure of fairness. Do you know of a measure of fairness that you believe would work for an AI model? Good. So the answer is we don't have a universally accepted measure of fairness, which is a challenge, because without a measure of fairness, you can't define compliance. Without compliance, you cannot get tools certified. So that is a challenge that we sort of have to deal with here. All right. I would like to thank our panel. Wonderful insights. I learned a lot. Thank you so much.